I'm going to speak now to Tirana Hassan, who's in New York. She's the Executive Director of Human Rights Watch. Thank you very much indeed for being with us. I understand that this report has produced a lot of interest, and you've been doing several press conferences as a result of that. I'd like to ask you about your assessment of the situation in Gaza compared to the other 99 countries that you have been monitoring over the last year.
Well, Human Rights Watch doesn't do a ranking of human suffering, but what we can say is that the situation in Gaza is dire. Through our research since the beginning of the conflict, Human Rights Watch has documented war crimes being committed, including the crime of starvation as a weapon of war, also collective punishment through the restriction to basic food, water, fuel, and life-saving humanitarian assistance, which has been imposed by the Israeli blockade. So, you know, the situation in Gaza is desperate, and it requires an immediate response from the international community. And what we've seen today, I think, with the International Court of Justice hearing South Africa's application, that they are arguing that Israel has violated its obligations under the Genocide Convention, is an important signal for the people of Gaza and to the world that there must be accountability for war crimes that are being committed in Gaza. But throughout this conflict, all parties to the conflict must abide by international humanitarian law, and they must be held to account when that is violated.
How confident can you be that those on both sides of this conflict will ultimately be held accountable, as you say?
You know, the question of accountability is a difficult one, but I don't think it's an option for us to think that it's not achievable. When we are dealing with human suffering and we are dealing with violations of international law at this scale, where thousands of people have been killed, including thousands of children, we are seeing, you know, the violations of international law, the tenets of international law, like the targeting of humanitarian workers, the killing of journalists, the targeting and the destruction of hospitals and medical facilities. It is important for our common humanity that we ensure that these do not go, that there is accountability, and that these crimes are not, we do not look away. You know, there have also been crimes that were committed inside Israel, and they also demand accountability. But this is not the only conflict in the world where we see the world looking away and not bringing the full forced rigor that is required to bring justice and accountability and to stop civilian suffering. The situation in Sudan, for example, in the Darfur region, has fallen off the agenda. We see thousands of people who have been displaced, women who have been victims of sexual violence and the targeting of the Masalit ethnic group. And, you know, that has received no international attention and requires the same level of commitment to ensure accountability that we saw in contexts like Ukraine, where we saw the international community throw all of the tools in the human rights and accountability toolkit at the situation. We saw investigations, we've seen ICC referrals, we've seen domestic investigations by countries who were prepared to put resources in to investigate and prosecute war crimes in Ukraine. And if anything, Ukraine shows us what is possible when the world stands up and takes violations of international humanitarian law seriously. And we should expect nothing less from the other conflicts in the world, from Myanmar to Ethiopia to Sudan to Gaza.
We in Al Jazeera regularly cover reports that are released by Human Rights Watch and other aid organisations around the world. So many of them are filled with tales of tragedies and harrowing stories of personal suffering. What do you think it takes to refocus attention onto these crises around the world? Gaza is the one at the moment, but you mentioned Sudan, of course. What does it take to re-engage governments and people as individuals to get more involved and take action on situations like this?
Well, The key is that we need to end two really damaging practices that Human Rights Watch documented as growing trends in 2023, and that is double standards. When we see the international community mobilise for some situations and not for others, because this sends a message that some lives are worth more than others. And that erodes trust in the international institutions which we rely on, like the UN Security Council, like the courts, like the General Assembly, that we rely on to deliver human rights and ensure accountability. So then end to double standards, and for states to stop being able to cherry pick and being selective about where they ensure that international humanitarian law and international law are implemented. Because you have to remember, human rights are not a nice to have. These rights emerged out of the darkest times in humanity. They were agreed upon by countries all over the world, and they are law. And when countries step outside of those laws or they violate those laws, they need to be held accountable. It doesn't matter who they are, what region they're in, or who their world leaders are, or who their world leaders are friends with. Accountability is for everyone. And the second practice that we need to see is that we have seen an alarming rise in states beginning to engage in what we call transactional diplomacy, where they turn a blind eye to human rights abuses in exchange for meeting some sort of short-term domestic need, which could be around natural resources, security, or migration. And increasingly, we've seen everything from the catastrophic the EU migration deals with countries like Tunisia and Libya, where the EU has just turned a blind eye to the serious abuses that are happening in those countries and against refugees and migrants in those countries in exchange for keeping migrants and refugees out of the European bloc. This simply just sends a message that these governments aren't accountable. And it emboldens them to go even further. And as a result, we saw countries, for example, like Rwanda, who have taken their repression across borders, where they're pursuing, where there's been no accountability for abuses at home, and now they're beginning to hunt down journalists, human rights defenders, and political dissidents abroad, from Sydney to Paris. So what it's going to take is clear and consistent and committed action from all states in all contexts.
Tirana Hassan is Executive Director of Human Rights Watch. We appreciate you being with us. Thank you very much indeed.